Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. We're going to start a multi-part video series going deep into the subject of Nimrod. It's one of the great mysteries of the Bible, the identity of this character who's mentioned in the book of Genesis. Now, despite only being mentioned several times in the scriptures, he's often thought of as being one of the greatest villains in all of biblical history, and even as the first prototype of the future Antichrist figure. And although the Bible only mentions him just several times, you're going to be amazed at how much ground we actually have to cover when we get into this subject. And like I said, it's going to take us several videos to do it. Believe me, there's a lot more that we could discuss that we won't even have a chance to get into. This topic is just so extensive. But let's begin. So, in the ancestry chart of early Genesis, Nimrod is called the son of Cush and the grandson of Ham, who was one of the three sons of Noah. So, he was the second generation born after the flood. And he's often considered to have initiated the building of the Tower of Babel. Although the Bible doesn't explicitly say this, it does seem to be clearly implied. Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, they all clearly name Nimrod as the character who was actually behind it and who mainstreamed the pagan system of worship that after Babel was then exported into the different people groups who were dispersed when the languages were scrambled. So it would seem that his desire was to build the tower in defiance of God after the flood, leading humanity to construct it in order to make a name for themselves and not to be scattered over the earth, in direct disobedience to God's instruction to do the complete opposite, to spread out and to replenish the now empty earth after the flood. Nimrod also epitomizes the dichotomy between the righteous patriarchs who were all pastoralists or farmers who were involved in animal husbandry. Basically, they were shepherds, versus the move to city life, which is often a symbol of wickedness in the Bible. Think about Abraham and Lot and how Lot chose Sodom and Gomorrah while Abraham went to the countryside. It's this consistent theme in Scripture, and Nimrod is shown to be a city builder. Because of this, he's often associated with rebellion against God for leading humanity into the worship of false gods and establishing the false religious system that has since come down through time. He's known as the first empire builder after the flood and the first post-diluvian or person who lived after the flood to become a mighty man in the earth, as the Bible calls him. He's said to be the founder of the city of Babel. And we see that Babel or Babylon then continues to be presented in the Bible as Babylon, both literally and metaphorically, representing the false religious system of the world down through time. Nimrod is basically seen as being the progenitor or the founder of all this. The ancient Jewish philosopher and historian Philo of Alexandria even associated Nimrod with the Nephilim giants. And the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, explicitly says that Nimrod began to become a giant on the earth, whatever that means. How does one become a giant? A video for another time, I guess. But clearly, something unique was going on with Nimrod. It's then no wonder that he's thought to have been associated in various cultures with gods and venerated heroes of old, like Osiris, Orion, Ninurta, Baal, Ninus, and Marduk, showing his widespread deification in the ancient world. But the major question surrounds his historical identity. Is there any evidence that Nimrod was an actual historical figure, as the Bible claims? And if so, who is he? Is there anyone whose exploits actually reflect what the Bible says about Nimrod? Well, of course, surely a person who is as notorious as Nimrod would be identifiable in history if he truly was a real historical character, again, as the Bible seems to present him as. So there should be some memory of him that's preserved as an actual historical king, not just some kind of mythical figure. As we'll find in these videos, it actually does seem that we're able to positively identify who Nimrod actually was. And although we can't be 1,000% sure about this, I'm going to present to you the reasons why I'm convinced that we can positively identify Nimrod as a historical figure, although one who most people who even enjoy ancient history probably are not aware of. But we're going to also discuss who Nimrod was not. Now, it's become common for people to identify Nimrod with several more well-known historical characters who actually don't fit the totality of the evidence. In fact, it actually seems that they weren't even alive at the right historical time period. So we'll talk more about that. So let's begin our study by looking into what the Bible itself has to tell us about Nimrod. So Nimrod makes his first appearance in Genesis 10:8 to 12. This chapter of Genesis discusses what's often called the Table of Nations, which records the genealogies of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, after the flood, and then their dispersion into different lands as the progenitors of the different nations of earth. Let me just tell you right now, before anyone turns this into a racial thing, no, Ham, Shem, and Japheth were not three different races who all came from the same parents. They didn't all pop out of the womb as three different races. Should be common sense. So-called races are the result of the accumulation of genetic traits over time. And there were no races yet at this time. They were all from the same family. No, Ham did not look like a sub-Saharan African, while his brother Shem looked like an Arabian, and while Japheth looked like some kind of a Nordic Viking. Guys, I hope we're all deeper thinkers than that. They were all brothers, and they undoubtedly all looked either the same or very similar, probably a medium tone complexion, because all the different races would have had to descend from a medium tone complexion, most likely. So as their descendants then spread out and went their own separate ways, it was only then, after many generations, that racial genetic traits started to develop. So please keep that in mind as we discuss Nimrod. So Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah and the grandson of Ham. So no, Nimrod did not look significantly different than Ham or Noah or Shem or Japheth. He was born during a time when everyone basically looked similar because they were all from the same extended family and there were no races yet. This is common sense, and it's simply the way genetics works. But looking to this ancestry chart in Genesis, it's interesting that Nimrod is distinctive in that he's the only one in this narrative who's actually separated out and expanded upon, showing his notoriety. Nobody else was really talked about like he was if you go and read Genesis 10. It's just Nimrod. So let's see what it has to tell us about him as this character is introduced. It says, and the sons of Ham, Cush and Mitzrayim and Put and Canaan, and the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Rama and Sabteka, and the sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city. Genesis 10:6 to 12. All right, so we learn a number of things from this passage. Number one, that Nimrod is a son of Cush, a grandson of Ham, and a great-grandson of Noah. And number two, Nimrod was known as being a mighty hunter. If you look into the Hebrew on this, when it says before the Lord, it actually means that he was a mighty hunter against or contrary to the Lord. You might not get that impression in most English translations, where his identification as a hunter can be seen in basically a neutral way. It doesn't come across as a positive or a negative statement. But like I said, if you look into the Hebrew on this, it seems that the true sense is negative. This is obvious from the context and the Hebrew itself behind the name Nimrod, which means we will rebel. We'll talk more about that later. But this negative context is also confirmed in a multitude of commentaries as well as ancient Jewish sources such as Targums, which basically are explanations of the text. So essentially, it's how the Jews always understood this. Now, one Bible commentary I'm going to share with you explains this as follows. It says, notice the word before in he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The word literally means face, that which is in the front and which appears to another as in face to face. Nimrod was a mighty hunter facing the Lord. The word before literally means that which turns. It has a wide variety of usages. It can be translated facing, before, in front of, or against. Against is the correct translation here, according to the context. He was a mighty hunter against the Lord. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord in the sense of fighting against him. You do not turn your back on your enemy. You face him, and he faces you. Nimrod was against God. He was facing the Lord in battle, in antagonism rather than in submission. That's shown in the context by his conquests. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. There is more here than meets the eye. He conquered Babel. He conquered Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. He was bringing what were probably city-states under his control and forcing them into one nation. Nowhere did God give the right to dominion over other men by conquering them, and that was what Nimrod did. So then, in light of this understanding, then the third thing that we learned from Genesis 10:6-12 is that Nimrod was in opposition to the Lord. Now, the fourth thing that we learn is that Nimrod's kingdom began in the land of Shinar. This is Hebrew for Sumer, the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia. This was between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, number five, then, is that the home base of his kingdom in Sumer were the cities Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. And then the last thing that we learn from this passage involves verses 10 and 11, although there's a controversy here that we need to point out. So I'll put the passage back on the screen. Now, specifically in the KJV, for instance, which is what I'm using here, there's an apparent mistranslation from the Hebrew into English that we should be aware of. So after speaking about the foundation of Nimrod's kingdom in Sumer in verse 10, it then abruptly mentions a character named Asher going out of that land to form the principal cities of Assyria. But this seems very strange right off the bat, because Asher, as a biblical character who was a son of Shem, not Ham, was not yet introduced. So far in this chapter, the genealogies being discussed were the sons of Ham, not the sons of Shem or Japheth. Now, the overwhelming majority of Bible translations, as well as many highly regarded ancient Jewish targums, do not say that Asher as a person did this, but rather that Nimrod, after founding the principal cities of Sumer, mentioned in the previous verse, then went forth into the land of Asher, or Assyria, and built those cities. Now, it's somewhat confusing in the Hebrew because country names like Assyria are written the same way as the person who is the progenitor of the people who live there, Asher. So it's intended to be a continuation of the exploits of Nimrod, who then went forth into what was later called Assyria to expand his kingdom. So is it trying to express the continuation of the exploits of Nimrod, who then went forth into what is later called Assyria to expand his kingdom? Or is it trying to introduce a new character named Asher here? Well, because the Hebrew can be interpreted either way, we need to consider a few points of evidence that I believe sway decisively toward this passage relating to Nimrod expanding his empire into what later became known as Assyria, a very recognizable place name to the audience at the time Genesis was being written. And not saying that Asher went forth to build those cities. It's saying Nimrod built them in the land that later became populated by the descendants of Asher. So the first reason that many people feel Nimrod is the correct understanding, which I agree with, is because, as I alluded to already, Asher was not yet mentioned in the Bible or in the table of nations yet here in Genesis 10. At this point in the chapter, when it's talking about Nimrod, the context was the sons of Ham. Asher was a son of Shem, and so he wouldn't be discussed until later in verse 22. So, from a context and common sense standpoint, it would seem strange that the text would abruptly depart from the discussion of the Hamitic sons and the Hamitic character Nimrod and his empire and jump to a son of Shem who wasn't mentioned yet. Now, another thing that I think is extremely powerful, even more so than that, is I want you to notice how the previous verse spoke of Nimrod's Sumerian cities being called the beginning of his kingdom. Now, that wording of beginning clearly implies the addition to it contained in these verses about Assyria. It's saying that Nimrod then expanded his kingdom to Assyria, because the definite mention of the beginning of his kingdom implies some sort of a continuation that then must refer to his latter or subsequent aspect of his kingdom expansion into, anachronistically, the land of Assyria. It will become called that later. So if you embrace the alternate wording of the KJV, then this beginning reference is oddly just dropped, and the context supposedly shifts to Asher founding the cities of Assyria. Now, clearly, that just makes no sense. The mention of a beginning requires something to then follow it. So, another important point relates to how the Bible always seems to interpret itself in a way that prevents us from getting the wrong idea about things. The Bible is the best interpreter of itself, I like to say. It always seems to clear up the issue in other areas of Scripture. And that seems to be the case here also, as one of the later mentions of Nimrod is found in Micah 5:6, which says, "And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our borders." So this passage equates the land of Assyria with the land of Nimrod. Now, some people might say, but this passage says the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod. So they're two different lands. But the truth is that this is actually common biblical phrasing and a common way to express the same thing in Hebrew. You call it one name, and then to make your point very clear, you call it by another name, referring to the same subject matter in a different way so that your point is clearly understood. This is also very similar in the Greek New Testament, where and can often be translated as even, meaning that you're using a second description to speak of the same thing that you already mentioned. It's like if you said the land of New York City and the land of the New York Yankees. It's two ways of saying the same thing, not saying two separate places. It means New York City, even the land of the New York Yankees. So that's the case here also in Micah 5:6. Now, any commentary you consult will show this understanding in the Hebrew. Or in modern English, we might say the land of Assyria, aka the land of Nimrod. That's basically what it's saying. And so we have proof here that Assyria, which was eventually populated by the descendants of Asher, hence called Assyria from Asher, was originally built by Nimrod as he expanded his kingdom northward and established those major cities. So the land of Assyria is the land of Nimrod, and thus Genesis 10:11-12 should be understood to read that Nimrod, after founding his empire in Sumer, pushed northwest into what would later be called Assyria and built many of its principal cities. In fact, this King James Version reference to Asher as a person instead of Nimrod is actually corrected in the New King James Version, which says, "From that land he," referring to Nimrod, "went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth Ir, Calah, and Rezin." Between Nineveh and Calah, that's the principal city. So there's no mention at all of Asher. And you'd see the same thing in, for example, the ESV. So the sixth point that we learn here from this passage is that Nimrod then expanded his empire northwest and founded Nineveh, Rehoboth Ir, Calah, and Rezin. So let's take a closer look at the cities that the Bible tells us were part of Nimrod's empire, many of which he's credited with building. And as we read, the first four cities were part of Nimrod's home base in Sumer: Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. The Bible doesn't explicitly say that he built these cities, but it does seem to be implied. Now, it's possible that some of these cities in Sumer, especially one that we're going to discuss, actually existed before the flood. And then after the flood, Nimrod somehow found these locations and rebuilt them. But either way, the point seems to be that Nimrod is at the very beginning of their post-flood rise to power. And I do believe that the clear implication in the Bible is that Nimrod is responsible for building or at least rebuilding them. So let's talk about each. We'll start with the least prominent and make our way to the most prominent. So let's start with Calneh. So Calneh has not yet been discovered in archaeology, but there's an alternative possible interpretation in this passage that's been advocated by some. It's that Calneh is not the name of a city, but that in the Hebrew, it means "and all of these," referring to the first three cities mentioned, "in the land of Shinar." So just another way of saying that the previous cities mentioned were all in the land of Shinar. So Calneh, we're not really sure about. So next is the city of Akkad. And Akkad is the name that also relates to the later Akkadian Empire that would rise around 2300 BC, founded by a king named Sargon. And Akkadian is also a Semitic language. Now, essentially, the later Akkadian Empire and language supplanted or followed the Sumerian Empire and language, or it came after it. It would seem that this title of Akkadian came from this city called Akkad, which became the capital of that later empire under Sargon. And the definite location of this ancient city is still unknown to archaeology, but several ancient sites have been suggested as possible locations. Now, later Akkadian historical inscriptions by Sargon himself do confirm that this city was his capital and, of course, did actually exist, although it hasn't been found. Now, although some people claim that the later King Sargon built the city, archaeologists and historians readily admit that the city existed prior to the time of Sargon and that he instead rebuilt it later on after it had been ruined in battle at some point, or that he built it up again. In fact, early Assyriologists noted that the name Agad or Akkad itself did not come from the Akkadian language, which further contributes to the evidence that the city itself pre-existed Sargon. So we'll talk more about Sargon in later videos, as many people have incorrectly identified Nimrod as Sargon. Now, next we have Erech, which has been positively identified as the ancient city of Uruk. Now, Erech is the Hebrew and Aramaic, and Uruk comes from the Akkadian. So Uruk was one of the oldest and most important cities in ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, this city was so important that some people believe this name is actually linked to the modern name of the country of Iraq, where it's located. And its location is near a place called modern-day Warqa, Iraq, about 160 miles south of Baghdad. Uruk is best known as the birthplace of writing around 3200 BC, as well as for its architecture and other cultural innovations. Now, of course, most of us learned in school how cities and culture sprang up seemingly from nothing in ancient Sumer. Agriculture, writing, technology, architecture, government, etc., all seem to rise up from out of nowhere. Now, to a person who recognizes the Bible as being genuine history, this would make perfect sense, and it refers to the period that follows the flood as society reemerged from a destroyed world. So, of course, this would happen. The Sumerian Uruk period is the time period in archaeology and history that's estimated to be basically their best guess is around the 3000s BC. So keep that rough figure in mind, 3000s BC. It's going to be important to us as we continue. The city of Uruk was a chief center for the cults of the worship of pagan deities. Not long after it was established, it was made a center for the worship of Inanna, who we may recognize as Ashtoreth or Ishtar, or the Queen of Heaven that's mentioned in the Bible. And also keep that in mind for later. It's going to be important to us to recognize who in ancient history is actually credited with founding this city or rebuilding it after the flood, whatever the case may be, and then immediately making it a cult center for the worship of Inanna, introducing this pagan worship. Now, the final Sumerian city that we're going to discuss is Babel. And this, of course, is very important, especially as it relates to the biblical story of the so-called Tower of Babel in the following chapter of Genesis, chapter 11. Now, most people assume that Babel here in Genesis 10 and also in Genesis 11 refers to what we think of as the city of Babylon, the capital city of the later Nebuchadnezzar and his Neo-Babylonian Empire. The city that invaded Israel and sieged Jerusalem and brought so many Judeans captive into the 70-year Babylonian exile. Now, this Babylon was located northwest of Uruk, about 300 miles from the Persian Gulf. And I put it on the map here so you can see its location. But there's one problem. That Babylon, this Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, right, that we all know about, that Babylon didn't exist yet at the time of Nimrod's founding of Babel and the events that followed involving the Tower of Babel. The earliest known mention of that Babylon comes much later, around 2200 BC, and at that point it's still a small town, and it's mentioned on a clay tablet during the reign of an Akkadian king. That city of Babylon would not rise to some level of prominence until much later, around 1900 BC, under the reign of the Amorite king Hammurabi, this called the Old Babylonian Empire. And it wouldn't be until around 600 BC that this same city of Babylon would come to power under Nebuchadnezzar, referred to in history as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But meanwhile, the Babel referred to in Genesis 10 was built long before by Nimrod, about 1,000 years before Babylon. So they can't be referring to the same city. Nimrod did not build the Babylon that we think of, the one from the book of Daniel, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. That was not Nimrod's Babel. The Babel of Genesis 10 must be a different city, a much earlier city. Now, before we identify this ancient city of Babel, we need to first discuss dating, and a very important issue that we must first contend with. So, to start off with, you might be asking where I'm getting these dates from. Well, the dating of the last three are quite well accepted in secular archaeology and history. My dating of Nimrod's founding of Babel and then the Tower incident is an estimate that comes from the Septuagint Old Testament, along with, of course, what's known from secular history and archaeology. Now, when the Septuagint is used, all of these dates match up very well with the secular account of the history and the archaeology of early Mesopotamia. Now, you might be asking why I'm specifying that it's according to the Septuagint Old Testament, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew into Greek around 300 BC, about 280 to be exact. The answer to that question is going to be foundational to providing the answer really to the overall question of this video, which is who is Nimrod in history? So, in order to identify Babel historically, and then also identify Nimrod historically, because they go together, there's a conflict that we need to first resolve, or at least acknowledge. And we're going to continue with identifying this mysterious city of Babel that's not the Babylon that we think of in just a moment, after we address this dating controversy. Now, that problem is the discrepancy between the genealogical dating that comes from the ages of the patriarchs given in the Septuagint versus what appears in our modern English Bible translations, which comes from the Masoretic text. Now, if you're not familiar with this dilemma, we're going to try to summarize it here very quickly, as this subject would require a separate video of its own to really even begin to address. But to get the most information out of this, I actually interviewed two of the most prominent authors on this topic, Henry Smith and Doug Woodward. I'll link to both of them in a pinned comment, so please check those out. So let me try to summarize this subject here. First, what is the Septuagint? Well, the Septuagint comes from the word itself comes from the Greek 70, and it's often abbreviated as LXX. And Septuagint is the name that's given to the translation of the original Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, into Koine Greek several centuries prior to Christ, again, between around 200 to 300 BC. The oldest existing actual manuscript of the Septuagint dates to the 300s AD. Now, to give some historical background here, Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language as early as the exilic or the post-exilic period, and Aramaic then became the language that was used mostly by the Jewish people. And then with the rise of Alexander the Great and the Greek empires, the Jews in the diaspora were Hellenized, and for many Jews, Greek actually became the primary language. And thus it became necessary for the scriptures to be translated into Greek. And this translation was the Septuagint, and it was the Bible that was used by Jesus and the apostles. It was the Bible of the early church. And actually, most of the instances in our Bibles today where the New Testament authors directly quote Old Testament passages, they're quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Old Testaments that are actually in our modern Bibles, hence the frequent difference in wording. So in other words, in your modern English Bible, grab your Bible, open it up, go find a New Testament instance where the author cites a direct quote of an Old Testament verse, and then go locate in your Bible that actual Old Testament verse where that quote is found. You're going to find that there's a good possibility that the wording is going to be very much different. That's because the New Testament writers were quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Old Testament that's found in our English Bibles today. And that's because our Old Testaments today came to us by a different line of transmission. It came through the Masoretic text, which came from the rabbinical tradition after the Christian era had begun. The Septuagint had become widely used by Christians, and Christians were routinely using it to very effectively prove that Jesus was the Messiah, and therefore convert Jews. So the church was rising and gaining steam, and this put a lot of pressure on Judaism. And there was other factors also. For instance, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, the Jewish religion was on life support. Even most of their religious manuscripts were destroyed. A Jewish religious school was then founded at a place called Yamnia, and the Jewish religion was reformed from temple Judaism into rabbinic Judaism, since there was no longer a temple or a priesthood, and therefore normative Mosaic Judaism could no longer be practiced, so it had to be reformed. And there's really an abundance of evidence that shows that this was the beginning of a rabbinical conspiracy to alter certain portions of the Hebrew Bible. And they were doing this to try to obscure the messianic claims of Jesus, to counter the claims of Christians. And the two primary areas that were tampered with include chronological dates and certain messianic prophecies that too clearly pointed to Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that our Old Testaments today are bad or horrible or should be totally thrown out. I'm not saying that at all, not even close. Actually, the Septuagint has problems of its own. That's why we do something called textual criticism. We try to find out what the original reading was. So I'm not saying that our Old Testaments are all bad. I'm just stating a fact. This is just a plain fact. There are notable differences in these two areas: chronology, dating, right? Ages of the certain patriarchs, and then certain messianic content. Those are the two areas, and it's just a fact. The question is whether it was purposefully edited by the rabbis for the reasons that I said. And again, I think the evidence shows that the answer is very clearly yes. You can watch those interviews to see more evidence for this. But getting back to Nimrod and Babel, this difference in chronology is going to be important because, again, the chronology of the ages of the patriarchs in the Septuagint is about 1,500 years longer than the chronology that we see in our Old Testaments today. 1,500-year difference. That's significant. So then this is critical for us in our examination of a topic like what we're discussing today, Nimrod and Babel, because deciding which version of Old Testament chronology you use, the Septuagint timeline or the Masoretic, is going to form the basis for understanding and really establishing the identity of both Nimrod and Babel, because they go hand in hand. So let me say that one more time because it's so important. Deciding which version of Old Testament chronology you decide to use, the Septuagint or the Masoretic, is going to form the basis for establishing the identity of both Nimrod and Babel. They both go hand in hand. So in other words, since the Masoretic text compresses the timeline of ancient history by about 1,500 years, then that's going to very heavily impact what historical figure was even alive at the time Nimrod is supposed to have lived, which is the Uruk period in Sumerian history, as well as our identification of Babel itself as an ancient city in archaeology that Nimrod could have lived at the same time as, and of course then could have built. So again, identifying Nimrod and Babel, these two things go hand in hand. That's why we're identifying Babel first. Both had to exist at the same time, obviously. So there needs to be both a viable candidate city for Babel at the same time as a viable candidate for Nimrod himself in our knowledge of ancient history. The two go together. So if you think the Masoretic chronology is correct, you're going to be looking in a totally different millennium than those who subscribe to a Septuagint chronology. And again, it's just a plain fact that the Septuagint chronology much better aligns with what we know from secular history and archaeology from the ancient world. So that in and of itself is compelling. Now, that's not to say that secular history is always 100% correct or perfect about everything. I definitely don't think it is, and it's impossible for it to be. And don't get the wrong idea. I'm not talking about millions of years or evolution or anything like that. I'm just talking about the past approximately 5,000 years of human history going back to about between 2000 to 3500 BC, which is overall largely accurate and pretty well understood for the most part in history and archaeology. Now, there could definitely be some variability in the estimates of certain dates, and many archaeologists would admit this themselves, especially the further back you go in time. Now, in the opinions of some archaeologists, there may even be several centuries of variability in certain cases, but we're not talking about thousands of years off. We know generally well what happened in the second, third, and somewhat even into the fourth millennia BC. And the plain fact of the matter is that the Septuagint aligns fairly well to the accepted understanding of history. But if you subscribe to a Masoretic dating, it significantly differs from secular ancient history by about 1,000 years or more, due to what I think is dating that's been tampered with. The timeline presented in the Masoretic starts to diverge once you get past about 1,000 BC or so. The further back you go, especially into the third and fourth millennia BC, the more the discrepancy widens. In fact, that's one reason why most secular academics don't view the Old Testament as a reliable historical source. It's largely because of the incorrect Masoretic dating, which is what's in our English Bibles today. The Septuagint chronology, though, would have a creation taking place somewhere around 5500 BC, the flood somewhere around 3400 BC, and the Tower of Babel around 3100 BC. And this would place the expected lifetime of Nimrod somewhere around 3200 to 2800 BC. And this actually aligns very well with what the historical and archaeological evidence, such as the sudden emergence of civilization in Sumer after the flood, the sudden rise of Sumerian city-states, and the rise of Uruk, and the other cities attributed to Nimrod, the beginning of writing, the spread of new languages would all indicate. So all these things are related to the 3000s BC in what's called the Uruk period of Mesopotamian history. However, on the other hand, the Masoretic chronology results in a very different timeline. It would show a creation date of around 4004 BC, and it has the flood around 2350 BC, and then the Tower of Babel about 100 to 150 years later, around 2200 BC. So according to this Masoretic dating, the lifetime of Nimrod should then be somewhere around 2300 to 1900 BC, almost 1,000 years later than the Septuagint. And these Masoretic dates would be far, far, far too late for any of these things that I just mentioned in history. You just can't theorize that Nimrod built the first cities of post-flood Sumer 1,000 years after we know that they were actually already built and settled. 1,000 years after the Uruk period, 1,000 years after the development of writing, and after the proliferation of languages and the rise of post-flood Sumerian civilization. We can go on and on. It's just far too late. Now, let me show you this on a chart with the accepted archaeological ages of ancient Mesopotamia. Now, here's how these significant events would fall according to the Septuagint dating. And you can see here that the rise of the city of Uruk, or Erech, which is attributed, as we said, to Nimrod, actually takes place within the Uruk period, just as it should. It takes place after the Ubaid period transitions to the Uruk period. Now, of course, these are terms that are used in secular history and archaeology, but we as biblical believers might attribute this crossover from Ubaid to Uruk as the crossover from the pre-flood world to then the world being destroyed during the flood, and then the reemergence of Sumerian civilization during the Uruk period after the flood, as these city-states were established by Nimrod, and he eventually builds the Tower of Babel. After he attempts to build the tower and it fails and language is scrambled, the Uruk period ends and then transitions into what's called the Jemdet-Nazar period. And this aligns also pretty well with what we know about history and archaeology of this time period. And beyond just Mesopotamia, this falls right into line with when the oldest civilizations that we know of are said to have started. Civilizations like dynastic Egypt and the Indus Valley civilization in India and Pakistan. They began to form around the ending of the 3rd millennium BC, give or take around 2800 BC. And this would make perfect sense with our Septuagint estimate of the timing of the Tower of Babel being around 3100 BC, where directly after that the people are dispersed, and within several hundred years, the great ancient civilizations emerge all around the world. And China and many other civilizations also would begin to emerge shortly after that. Another thing is that writing also emerged around 2800 BC. Now, of course, soon after the dispersion of languages at Babel, writing would have become more of a necessity than ever before. And so all of this would make perfect sense according to the Septuagint dating. Now, interestingly, we'll find that the character that we're going to identify as Nimrod was actually attributed in the ancient Sumerian traditions as being the inventor of writing. And incredibly, it actually seems to be directly related to the Tower of Babel story. More on that later. But now let me show you what the Masoretic chronology would look like, with the flood being around 2350 BC and the tower being around 2200 BC. So you can see that everything is immediately out of place. Everything would be far too late. Nothing at all lines up with anything we know from history and archaeology. Now again, I'm not saying secular history is perfect, especially the earlier it gets. But this disparity would be extreme, and it's clearly not viable. And so it should be clear to us already, just from this short review, that relying on the Masoretic dating to lead our search is not going to get us to a sound identification of Nimrod nor the city of Babel, among the others that he established. Now, back to our subject of trying to identify Babel so that we can then identify Nimrod. And I'm going to put up the ancient Mesopotamia map on the screen, this time with the later location of Babylon, just so you can see where it would eventually be located. Now, like we said, the Babylon that we usually think of, this Babylon did not exist at any time in the 3000s BC when we would expect Nimrod to be alive, the time that we also know the first post-flood Sumerian cities emerged. So again, Babylon instead was probably built around 2300 BC, about 1,000 years later. So the dates are just too far apart for this Babylon to be the setting of the story that we see in Genesis 10 and 11 with Nimrod in the tower. But there's also a biblical reason for the setting to have to be in some other city. I want to show you this in Genesis 11:8, where after the scrambling of the languages at the Tower of Babel, we're told that they stopped building the city. Now, this is another problem for those who want to identify Babel of Genesis 10 and 11 with the later city of Babylon. That Babylon was occupied continually. There was no lapse. There was no point where they stopped building the city. It was occupied continually from around 2300 BC when it began until its abandonment in the 8th century AD. So then, given that the people stopped building the city of Babel, according to the Bible, but Babylon, that Babylon, was continuously occupied for 3,000 years, then that Babylon could not be the site of the Tower of Babel, despite the word Babel used as its name. So, what city then is Babel? Well, there's very strong evidence that points to the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu as being the Babel of Genesis 10 and 11, which was built or rebuilt by Nimrod after the flood, and which would serve as the location for the attempted Tower of Babel. The site of the remains of Eridu, known today as Tel Abu Sharain, is located about 12 miles to the southwest of the famous city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, which many people mistakenly think Abraham is from. More on that a different day. But the evidence is strong that Eridu is the Babel that's spoken of in early Genesis. So let's go through a couple of points of evidence that I think are going to very easily demonstrate this. So the first thing is that Eridu was known to the Sumerians as being the first city built in Shinar, or Sumer, and maybe even the world. Now, according to the ancient Sumerian Kings List, which is an ancient manuscript that records the names, reigns, and locations of Sumerian kings, Eridu was the first city in the world. The opening line says, "When kingship from heaven was lowered, the kingship was in Eridu." And in Sumerian mythology, Eridu is actually said to be one of the 5 cities in Sumer that were built before the flood occurred. Eridu appears to be the earliest settlement in the region, founded around 5400 BC, which is very close to when we believe the creation occurred, according to the Septuagint chronology. That would make Eridu, very likely, if this is true, the oldest city on earth, and the original Eridu being pre-flood. So then it would seem that after the flood, Nimrod once again located these destroyed sites and rebuilt these cities. So in other words, he was trying to rebel and return to what God had just destroyed, to recover the ancient pre-flood knowledge, and to reinitiate the communication with the fallen sons of God of the antediluvian world, which really seemed to be his purpose behind trying to rebuild the tower. Or to put it another way, he was reinstituting the worship of a pagan system that would then, after the dispersion at Babel, be exported into all the nations of the earth. And that would be the backdrop to God then calling out Abraham to form his own nation that would be unpolluted by these pagan corruptions of Nimrod, a nation that would then produce the messianic line. And that's why right after the Babel incident in Genesis 11, the Bible transitions right to the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, this whole idea of Nimrod rediscovering and rebuilding the pre-flood remains of cities like Eridu actually seems to be confirmed in a later version of the flood story written by Berosus, who was a Babylonian priest and historian around 200 BC, although in this story he seems to conflate the Noah and the Nimrod characters together as one. He says that after the flood, the character hears a voice from afar instructing him to return and to find and dig up the antediluvian writings buried in a city called Sapar, which is another ancient Sumerian city, and reestablish Babel and the cities and temples from before the flood. And it would seem that that's exactly what Nimrod was going about trying to do in his rebellion. So, what we just discussed shows the great antiquity of Eridu as potentially being the oldest city in the world and the first Sumerian city built or rebuilt after the flood during the expected lifetime of Nimrod. And meanwhile, the other Babylon wouldn't even be built for another 1,000 years or more. And so that's the first reason that connects Eridu as Babel. Now, the second reason that Eridu fits the Babel identification is due to the same exact construction technique that's described for us in Genesis. We see this in Genesis 11, 3 to 4. It says, "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" So the Bible specifically says that the builders of the city of Babel and the tower used baked mud brick construction and bitumen for mortar. Now, interestingly, when the site at Eridu was excavated by archaeologist Fuad Safar in the late 1940s, evidence of baked mud bricks and bitumen was found, which dated back to the 3000s BC, exactly when, according to history and archaeology, civilization sprung up in ancient Sumer, and exactly when the Septuagint chronology would place the flood and then the post-flood urbanization of Sumer at the exact time when Nimrod would have been alive to build these cities and this tower. There wasn't any stone to be found in that region for building, so bricks were of course needed. And baked mud bricks are stronger than just sun-dried bricks, which allowed the construction of very tall structures like ziggurats, which is undoubtedly what the Tower of Babel actually was. A ziggurat was a huge multi-platform structure that was designed to replicate an artificial mountain, and it was intended for the worship of the gods, to sort of elevate the priest toward the heavens, but maybe even more accurately, to create a pagan opening to bring the heavens to the earth or to connect the two. And the builder's intention to reach the heavens reflects their purpose to use the ziggurat as a meeting place for humans and the gods. So, this idea of reaching into the heavens was a phrase that was built into the ancient Near Eastern concept of a ziggurat. And this is exactly what we're told in the biblical account talking about the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, 1 to 9. It shows us this effort by humans to construct a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. It's exactly what a ziggurat was supposed to be to the ancient Sumerians. We have it in their writings preserved for us today, the people of Nimrod's day. So even the wording in Genesis corresponds exactly to the ancient descriptions of ziggurats as mountains that reach into the heavens. And so this brings us to the third piece of evidence, which is the fact that Eridu is known for its temples and the ruins of its ziggurat. In fact, the ziggurat ruins of Eridu are actually far larger and far older than any others, and it seems to best match the biblical description of the unfinished Tower of Babel. And at Eridu, archaeologists found the remainder of a Sumerian sacred precinct that had a ziggurat, a temple, and a complex of other structures on a enormous 1,000 foot or 300 meter square platform. So we have a couple of things to look at here. So we have a huge 300 meter square platform or a terrace, the remains of a ziggurat of a later period that was built over a pre-existing building on that platform, and then an adjacent area where there were a series of 17 temples to the god Enki built over the top of each other as time passes. And each new temple was built directly on top of the previous older temple. And each subsequent temple was built on a larger and higher elevated platform over top of the old temple to Enki. And so here's a sketch of the sequence of temples from Fuad Safar and his team who performed the excavation. And if you're interested in reading about their findings in detail, you can find a free PDF of their book Eridu on the internet. A lot of these images came from that book. The archaeologists found remains of the earliest temple, temple number 17, but the second temple, temple 16, was very well preserved, and it's pictured here in this photo. It was pretty small, about 3 by 3 meters, about the size of a small bedroom, and it included a burnt offering table made of mud bricks, and an area at one end that was a mud brick platform to place an idol of Enki. And excavations also found burnt ash near the offering table. Now, the most recent temple, temple number 1, was very large, and it was dated to the 3000s BC, again, the time of Nimrod, the Uruk period, which is also sometimes called the Proto-Literate period. Now, keep in mind, this temple that we're talking about is not the Tower of Babel itself. It's the last of 17 temples that some Christian archaeologists think that Nimrod actually built before greatly expanding the raised platform in preparation for the much larger Tower of Babel. So, in other words, this temple number one is adjacent to the platform where it's believed the tower was being built. So, here's a better image showing the location of both. The large 300-meter square platform was also originally dated to the 3000s BC, again, the time of Nimrod. After it was excavated, it was found that it and whatever was on it had sat abandoned for around 1,000 years, after which a later king named Ur-Nammu, during the third dynasty of Ur, reshaped the platform and constructed a ziggurat on top of it. This was around 2100 BC, and that ziggurat would then be the 18th level. So that means that any remains of the earlier Tower of Babel would lie underneath this ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, the remains of which are still visible today, although in bad shape. I'll put a couple of images up here for you to see what it looks like today. And so you can see that this site is not very well preserved. But let me go back to the previous image showing the raised platform, as well as one of the temples to Enki located adjacent to it. So, what's been proposed by some is that Nimrod was the designer and the builder of all these temples to Enki, number 17, which was the earliest one, all the way up to number 1, the largest and the most recent one. All of these between about 3200 and 2800 BC. And that the massive abandoned platform, 300 meters by 300 meters, was the foundation or the first platform or terrace of the biblical Tower of Babel, where Nimrod attempted to build an original ziggurat. And the archaeologists who examined the site did say that there was likely an original, more important ziggurat on this platform from the earlier period that pre-existed the one built on that site 1,000 years later by Ur-Nammu, but they weren't able to excavate down to that level. So again, the original ziggurat is believed by some to have been Nimrod's attempted Tower of Babel that was left unfinished. And that brings us to point number 4, which is that Eridu was abandoned after the end of the third millennium, around 3000 BC, which happens to be the same time as the dispersion of languages at the Tower of Babel. As we've already said several times, the archaeologists who examined Eridu also concluded that the site was temporarily abandoned at exactly the time the Septuagint chronology places the estimated date of the Tower of Babel. This is exactly what the Bible says happened at Babel after the scrambling of the languages. It says that after that took place, they left off building the city. Or in other words, they stopped building it. The site was abandoned. So let's see this in Genesis 11, 7-9. It says, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now the archaeologists tell us that Eridu would be abandoned and uninhabited for about a millennium, until the later kings Ur-Nammu and then after him Amar-Sin and others would try to rebuild a ziggurat on that site beginning about 2100 BC. And bricks have even been found with Nebuchadnezzar's stamp, an additional 1500 years after that. So it seems that all the Mesopotamian kings had this incredible fascination with reconstructing Eridu, which should tell you of its prominence, its importance, and also its great antiquity, which also further confirms that this was the location of Babel. This is where it all started, where it all happened. So all these kings sort of saw themselves as trying to continue the lineage of this great ruler of early Mesopotamia, Nimrod, the first empire builder of ancient Sumer, who ruled from Eridu and then Uruk. And like we briefly mentioned before, that later city of Babylon, the Babylon of the book of Daniel, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, was never abandoned, which again removes it from consideration as the true Babel of early Genesis. But I want to also point something else out from this verse that's going to lead us to the next point. So notice how Babel obviously wasn't called Babel prior to the confusion of the languages. After describing the scrambling of the languages by God, the verse very clearly says, "Therefore its name was called Babel." So the passage says it was called Babel because of or after the languages were confused, because Babel means confusion. Now, Babel appears to be a mix of the Akkadian word Bab-ilu, which means gate of the gods, and the Hebrew word Balal, which means to confuse. And so Babel seems to be a play on words in the Hebrew. But this aspect of the Babel story is also part of the Sumerian tradition, as we'll see further ahead in the video. But we shouldn't be surprised that Babel was not the original name of the city. It was named Babel as a result of what happened at the tower. The original name was Eridu. But let's talk about the name, Eridu or Babel. So the Sumerian name for Eridu was Eridug-ki. The Akkadian was Iritu, where we get Eridu. But there's some significant name connections between Eridu and Babylon. This is going to act as our proof number 5. So Eridu and Babylon were often referred to interchangeably. Now first, one name of Eridu in cuneiform logograms was pronounced Nun-ki, meaning the mighty place in Sumerian. But much later, the same Nun-ki was used to mean the city of Babylon. And secondly, the later Greek version of the Sumerian king list by Berosus, around 200 BC, actually reads Babylon in place of what had said Eridu in the earlier versions when describing the name of the oldest city, where we said kingship was lowered from heaven. So this association very strongly suggests that Eridu is the original biblical Babel. And then later on, Babylon was referred to by the same name. And so this is our map of Sumer, or the biblical land of Shinar in northern Mesopotamia, where the Bible says Nimrod began his kingdom. We've identified Erech as Uruk, Agad as Akkad, which the exact location is not confirmed, Calneh also not confirmed, and Babel as Eridu. And it aligns with what we know about the history of the Uruk period itself. And so that was Genesis 10, verse 10. But now to go to the next verse, Genesis 10, verse 11, it goes on to describe the expansion of Nimrod's kingdom to the northwest, as we said before, up to the land of Assyria. And this may represent something historians refer to as the Uruk expansion, which describes a spread of South Mesopotamian culture to nearby and far-off regions. This also took place during the 3000s BC, and historians are unsure of what exactly to attribute this expansion to. But I think it's very obvious from an understanding of Genesis that it can be attributed at least partially, probably greatly, to Nimrod's expansion northwest and the ripple effect that that caused to more distant lands, and even more so after the Tower of Babel incident as people spread out. So again, a review of Genesis 10, 8-12 says, "From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city." All right, so let's try to identify these cities like we did with the cities of Shinar. So first, Rezin and Rehoboth-ir have not been positively identified, but the other two have. Calah is the city called Kalhu in Assyrian. But very interestingly, it's actually located today as an archaeological site that goes by the name Nimrod, of course named after Nimrod. It's located just to the east of the Tigris River in northern Iraq, about 20 miles south of the modern city of Mosul. And there was actually a ziggurat located there that was partially demolished by ISIS terrorists in 2016. Unfortunately, a lot of damage has been done to harm the archaeological sites and the artifacts in this region. And the last city, the most important one in this region, was Nineveh, and it's located north of Calah, and the site's encircled by the modern city of Mosul. Now, the ruins of Nineveh were undiscovered until the 1800s, and some secular scoffers actually used this as a reason to question the Bible's reliability, until they were uncovered and excavated by Austin Henry Layard in 1846 and 1847. And further work was then done by Campbell Thompson and George Smith, among others, up to the present time. And it's really revealed the incredible scope of this once great biblical city. So as usual, the Bible is eventually proven to be correct. And this also reminds me of how some people mock the Bible's frequent mentions of an ancient people called the Hittites, saying that it demonstrated the illegitimacy of the Bible as being a reliable historical source. But today you can get your doctorate degree in Hittite studies in universities. So again, the Bible is proven to be correct. But back to Nimrod's cities. So one of the discoveries made at Nineveh was what's been called the Bevel Rim Bowls. And this is one example of the archaeology of the Uruk expansion. And these bowls were typical of Uruk or Erech pottery of that time period, which were then found to have become widespread throughout the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in the late 3000s BC, exactly at the time of Nimrod. And some Christian archaeologists have even suggested that these bowls were invented during Nimrod's early reign, and then they were mass-produced in molds and used in bread factories to feed workers, supporting the rapid expansion and building of his kingdom. Now, these bowls would have been dispersed even more widely following the Tower of Babel. And so this is our map of the kingdom of Nimrod in Mesopotamia with all the cities that had been located. Now you might be wondering why we went so in depth on locating all of these cities and all this background information. Well, the answer is that understanding these cities is important contextual information in order to then correctly identify who Nimrod actually was in history. Because if you don't understand anything about early Mesopotamian history, about the geography, the locations of that time, about historical dating, then you're not going to be very informed about how to correctly identify Nimrod or when he even was alive. And that's going to allow us now to move into identifying who he was historically. So this should not be overly difficult to do now that we have such a solid basis of understanding about correctly dating the time period and the geography in which Nimrod lived. So in the next video of this series, we're going to look into the evidence that uncovers the actual historical identity of Nimrod himself. So I want to thank you all for watching. God bless you guys, and I will see you on the next video.